Hello, beautiful people. It's Rachelle Ray, your prosperous life coach, mental health counselor, and motivational speaker. On today, I'm going to continue talking about grief and loss and how to process that. Yesterday, I spoke about the types of loss that people experience when they lose a loved one. And so, grief can be defined as a natural process in response to a loss that has been experienced. It's the emotional pain that you feel due to that loss, whether it's a person or a thing, something that you held in high regard or you had high value for. So that's where you begin to feel that loss placed on the value that you placed on that person or the loss or the job that occurred, and that triggers you going into feeling overwhelmed, experiencing difficult and unexpected emotions that you probably weren't having before. And so the pain from this grief can disrupt your physical health, making it hard to sleep, eat. Those are some of the things I went over yesterday. So continuing with the grieving process, today we're going to talk about how to deal, how to cope. And so briefly on yesterday, I mentioned that you had to acknowledge your pain, acknowledge that there's a loss, because if you don't acknowledge it, then you're in the first stage of grief, which is known as denial. And I'll talk more about that on tomorrow. I'll do another video tomorrow. So I'm just going to give a little bit at a time so that it's not overwhelming, and then you have something to do at each step. So yesterday we talked about grief, what it is, and the different types: acute grief, integrated grief, and complicated grief. And complicated grief is when it's been more than 2 years, 3, 4, 5, and you need to get help from a counselor and go through psychotherapy so you can help get past that and get back to living life. And we talk about how when you have grief, you can feel guilty because you think that you shouldn't be here and that you shouldn't go on with your life. But in essence, you need to go on with your life so that you can honor the person that you lost and live a life of purpose so that you can celebrate them and honor their memory. So it's important. So when you're going through the grieving process, the first thing you want to do is acknowledge that there's a loss. It's okay to talk about it. It's okay to experience the emotions that you have when you are notified or become aware that the loss has taken place. The second part of the grieving process is to have acceptance. You want to accept that grief can trigger many different and unexpected emotions. If you don't accept that, it's going to be hard for you to go on through the process, and then you stay stuck in the denial stage. So once you acknowledge the death, the loss that you experience, you want to accept that, okay, this is something that has happened. You want to accept that these are the feelings and the emotions that you're currently having. And it's okay for you to go through that in light of what you're experiencing. So after you acknowledge, you want to accept. And then the third step in coping with grief is being able to understand that the grieving process will be unique to you. It's different for each person. No two people are going to grieve the same way. Some people are able to find out about a loss or death of a loved one and not have any emotions and not be sad. They still feel like they were feeling before they found out. Others have an intense, immediate reaction. Some people are able to, continue on, and we'll talk about that more as the styles or the continuum of grief. How you have different one line, but at each line there's a different way that people grieve. And so I'll get into that a little bit. So that's why you have to understand that just because you cry and another person doesn't cry doesn't mean that they're not grieving. Or The person who is not crying or not showing any uh, emotion, as far as you can see, they may act out in anger, or they may begin to have disruptive or maladaptive behavior. So everyone grieves differently. So it's okay that your grieving process looks different from anyone else. So it's important to know that. The fourth step is seek out face-to-face support. If you have a support system already in place, a group of friends that you're close to, you want to reach out to them while you're going through. It's okay not to suffer in silence. It's okay to let people know that you're not okay and this is a struggle for you, that you're going through a hard time. So people who care about you, who've been there for you in the past, reach out to them and let them know that you need them to support you emotionally at this time, or physically. Maybe it's a struggle for you to get up out of bed, so you may need them to call you and say, hey, it's time to get up, I'm coming over, to help give you that extra push. So tap into that support system that you have. Maybe every day you talk to a different person for 5-10 minutes at certain times to keep you connected, to give you that uplift that you need as you go through this time. The fifth part of coping in the grieving process is to support yourself emotionally. And you do this by taking care of yourself physically. So your emotional needs and your physical needs need to be taken care of. For instance, if your emotions are all over the place, the way you can take care of that physically is by sleeping. And I'm not talking about like, oh, you just don't want to get out of bed where you're in a depressed state, but giving your body time to relax and to rest, which will allow your mind to rest and be at ease. And that way you're not, so far over here because you have this adrenaline going because you're so sad, and then your mind is just racing. So allowing yourself that physical rest, just to sit in a place quiet, still, that'll give you time to calm your emotions. Doing deep breathing, that'll help you to calm your emotions. So that's how you take care of yourself physically for your emotional needs. And lastly, recognize the difference between grief and depression. Grief is going to happen for, a brief period of time, 1-2 years. But depression, it's going to be where you can't even go about your normal routine. There's going to be an extended period of grief, and that's when you get into the complicated grief where depression begins to set in, and we'll talk about that more. But I just wanted you to know those are the things that you can do to help you deal with the grieving process as you're grieving. And also from a physical perspective, some people feel fatigue or tired, or they have nausea, where they feel like they want to throw up, but nothing's coming up and it's just right there. Some people immune system gets lowered because of grief. Some people gain weight, some people lose weight because of that loss of appetite, or either they're emotionally eating because of the death of a loved one or a loss of a job, and then they gain weight. So each person is going to be different throughout the grief process. Other people feel aches and pains. It's like they're so tense. They begin to have shoulder aches or leg aches. They begin to feel it in different parts of their body. So those are some physical symptoms. On yesterday, I mentioned lack of sleep. Some people aren't able to sleep. And then some people oversleep. They sleep too much, trying to block out the pain and the memory that they actually lost someone or that they lost their job. So those are some physical symptoms that you can be aware of as you grieve the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a job. So I want to give you a metaphor to help understand the grief process. So we talked about acute grief, integrated grief, and complicated grief. So think of acute grief as a deep wound, a wound you just got to cut. Okay, and this is a fresh wound. And when you cut yourself, it's intense pain the moment that it happens. It's important for you to know that that pain is a part of you acknowledging that, oh, something is wrong. I hurt myself. There's a wound. And it allows the body to begin to heal itself. So you having this acute, immediate onset of the loss that you experience, it's a way for you to acknowledge that emotional hurt, that emotional pain that you feel in that void, and allow you to begin the healing process. Because if you don't acknowledge it, it's like I have a deep wound right here, but I ignore it, so it's going to not heal. It's going to fester if I ignore it and don't acknowledge that I'm in pain, and then see, okay, what's causing this pain? Where's the pain coming from? So you have to acknowledge it, and then you have to say, okay, what are some things that I need to do so I can heal properly? And as time goes by with this wound, it begins to heal over time. And so that deep wound that you had now becomes a scar. Or before you even get the scar, you can tell that it's healing because you see a little scab form on the top. And then it begins to get itchy as it heals and dries up. And if you keep picking at it, then it goes back to being that fresh wound. But if you acknowledge the pain and put salve on it and attend to it that way, then it'll continue with the gradual healing process. And this is how you know that you're into integrated grief. Okay? The wound is closed, it's no longer open, it's closed. And now you see the scar. And so when you touch it, there's still some tenderness, but those intense emotions that you initially felt when you found out about the loss or the death of a loved one is not so bad. But it's just there. It's just a little tenderness, but you're still able to cope and acknowledge and get through your day. It's not like it was when it initially happened, that first day, that first month, the first 6 months. But as you get near towards the second half of the year, and then going into the second year, that's where you have that tenderness, and you may see something or someone say something and it triggers a memory, and then you'll have a wave wash over you. But you know that you're in the integrated grief because that pain, that emotional hurt that you were feeling is not as intense. And it's okay to acknowledge that, okay, there's still some longing there for that person, or there's still some longing there for that employment that you had. But in the case of employment, the thing that you need to do is acknowledge that, okay, I'm at a new chapter. I no longer have this job. I no longer have this income. So once you acknowledge that and accept those emotions that are rushing and flooding through you, you can take a deep breath. And then you can say, okay, what do I need to do? The first thing I would recommend is pulling out your resume. Go over and review it. Do you need to freshen it up? Make some changes. Update and tweak some things and some skills that you've learned since the last time you created it. So do that. And then the next step is to go ahead, go to LinkedIn, post your resume, go to monster.com, hotjobs.com, these different websites, and begin to post your resume and apply for other jobs. And so that'll get the motion going, and that'll help you to begin to heal your process and have hope that, okay, there's other employment out there. Watch your local news. A lot of them are posting virtual job fairs. Talk to people in your support system. Let them know, hey, I was laid off or furloughed due to the pandemic. Or do you know of anyone that's hiring? Are you aware of any available positions? So that'll get the word of mouth going, and people will begin, to post. If you have social media, post on social media. I just lost my employment. I'm seeking employment. Do you know of anyone that's hiring? So a lot of companies are hiring. So those are some things that you can do. Go to your local work source or unemployment office. They also have a board of available positions. Go to some of the colleges' websites. They usually have a job board where they help college students prepare for a resume and meet potential employers. Those are some websites that you can tap into and find employment. So you do have hope, and there are some things that you can do. And so once your wound healed, I'm going back to the metaphor for our grief process. Sometimes the wound becomes infected because we didn't tend to it properly. We didn't go through our grieving process properly. And so now we begin to have complications. And the same thing with your employment. If you lost your job, if you don't begin to take proactive steps now, it'll linger, and you'll be like, well, I have all of these financial burdens that are coming up. Is because you delayed the process. File for unemployment if you haven't thought of that or done that yet. Keep trying until you get through. And so when you don't take immediate steps to acknowledge and experience those emotions that you go through, it leads to complications. And this is the complicated grief. And this is where you continue to feel the immense pain you felt at the very onset of finding out about your loss. And instead of it numbing and just being tender like it would be at the integrated stage, it's just as intense, if not more intense, than what you felt. And so you still begin to have this pain, and it feels worse instead of getting better like it should over time. And that's when you have to get professional help so you can get out of that place. Okay? So that's a metaphor, an easier way to think about the grieving process in addition to the steps that I gave you earlier. So I also mentioned that people grieve differently. And so the styles of grief that most people exhibit or that fall along a continuum is called instrumental grief and intuitive grief. Okay? So when people find out about a loss, they may do one or the other and then gradually switch over to the opposite side. That's why I said the grieving process is going to be unique to each individual. Instrumental grief is known as the focusing part of grief. This is when, you found out about a loss and you go on to autopilot. This is when you get into problem solving mode. Okay, where's the insurance policy? What funeral home we're going to use? Is there a burial plot? Picking out the casket, creating the funeral program, getting the information out that to your family members and your loved ones when the service is going to be, preparing for the repast afterwards, closing out your loved one's estate and meeting their final wishes if they had a living will prepared or any of those type of issues. And it's just getting that data and closing things out. So you're on autopilot. That's instrumental grief. You're doing what needs to be done and you're not really showing emotion. Okay. Now the other side of that is intuitive grief. This is the people who focus on the feeling part of grief. So they have strong emotional responses to the loss, and it's more of an outward display of emotion versus the instrumental grief. So neither one is wrong. It's just that that's what that particular person gravitated to when they found out about the loss. Now, the person who starts out in instrumental grief, as time goes on, because they hadn't fully processed and they just went into autopilot, maybe a month, 2-3 months later, you'll see them gradually shifting over into intuitive grief. And the person who starts out in intuitive grief, you'll see the same process with them going to the opposite side. Now they begin to say, okay, what needs to be done? We have to pack up their clothes. We need to remove their things from the room, maybe give it away as donations, or have a garage sale. Are there any final bills that need to be paid? And so the roles reverse on a continuum. So that's why the grieving process is unique to each individual, and the way you grieve is the way you grieve. And the people who have intuitive grief are more likely to seek out emotional support versus instrumental grief. They're less emotionally expressive about their loss when it first occurs. However, they do switch. Okay. And so men and women experience both types of griefs. Okay. So there's no right or wrong way. The best thing to do is to make sure that you give yourself time to grieve and not to ignore the process, because then that's when you come into complications and things that way. And it's also important for you to take care of yourself while you're going through your grieving process. On the last video, I gave you a technique called the goodbye letter. So hopefully you had a chance to do that, and that helped you to begin to acknowledge and go through the pain of losing your loved one or your job, and feeling those emotions to allow you to heal. So for this video, if you enjoy writing and that benefited you, I would recommend starting a journal, and journal about your thoughts and your emotions as you go through your grief process. So that's one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is create a scrapbook or photo album of your loved one, celebrating their life as a way to celebrate. If they were into volunteer work or they had a cause that was near and dear to them, maybe you can do something that way to help you in your grief process by volunteering or starting a foundation in their name. Other ways to deal with grief is to plan for your triggers, such as holidays. They can reawaken memories. And so being prepared for that ahead of time, knowing a holiday is coming, then, okay, we're going to include a section where we're going to remember our loved one, or we're going to remember something they did or said, and that will ease in the emotional pain that you have when you have these triggers, if you plan for them. And having those triggers are normal. It's okay for you to acknowledge, okay, I'm feeling a wave of sadness, because they would be here and they would be saying this or that. So acknowledging it and letting those emotions surface and experiencing those emotions, knowing that you don't have to stay there because it'll pass, but you acknowledge it so you don't have to suppress it, because when you suppress it, it's going to come up more explosively later on. So for this time, I want you to make a scrapbook or a photo album to celebrate your loved one. Okay? And when you suppress, it prevents you from healing properly. And it makes it take longer for you to heal and go through that grief. So it's important for you to acknowledge that and let it surface. So journaling would be a good thing to do, especially when that happens, and you can just write the date and time and then say what the memory or the event was that triggered and made you feel that wave of sadness. Okay, and that will allow you to keep from feeling guilty because you have moved on with your life. You don't have control of that. You're not God. We don't say when people, is going to keep living and when they're going to stop living. If someone plans a murder, in that instance, yeah, but for the most part, the natural occurrence of life, we don't get to choose those times. You know, we can do our best to work and try to prevent and prolong, but ultimately we're not God. So we have to be accepting of that and be willing to honor the time that they were here and celebrate their life. So what are some things that you can do to celebrate their life? That's the most important thing. So remember to take care of yourself physically. Remember, it's okay to acknowledge what you're going through and reaching out to others in your support system. And that it's a process and you'll get through it and things will lessen as time goes over. You don't have to rush through the process. Okay, then that would be prematurely, and then boom, you know, it comes back more intensely had you let it take the natural progression that needed to take. So for the next video, I'm going to talk about the stages of grief. And then I'll give you another activity that you can do to help you as you grieve during this time. So remember to share this video with as many people as you can. There have been a lot of people who have lost loved ones due to the pandemic, or maybe they lost someone before the pandemic occurred and they just didn't have the skills or know what to do to deal with the grief, and you can see that they're still struggling. So these videos will help them, and if it has moved on towards depression, recommend that they seek out a counselor, a mental health professional, to help them get through that so they can heal properly and get back to life. Remember, I'm Rochelle Ray, your Prosperous Life Coach, mental health counselor, and motivational speaker. May you be in good health even as your mind prospers. Bye-bye.